Amen.
Larry Brilliant, welcome back to World Affairs. It's good to have you.
Ray Suarez, it is a pleasure to see you.
Well, we spoke at the beginning of the pandemic, and during that program, you said this is not the zombie apocalypse, but it's going to be a very bumpy road. We don't have an antiviral. We will not have a vaccine for 12 to 18 months, and we need to prepare for the long haul. We're in for a tough time, but it's not a mass extinction event. What's transpired in the intervening 10 months or so that's confirmed your thinking back then at the beginning of the year or surprised you?
Thanks, Ray. It really is wonderful to see you. Well, I think that what I said back then has indeed unfolded. No credit to me. I think I was channeling the sum total of all the epidemiologists who've been struggling with pandemics for these many years. And every one of us probably could have said exactly that. What we didn't take into consideration, because we've never faced it before, is the complete failure of governance and leadership, primarily at the United States federal level, with no national plan and with a president who seemed dismissive and uninterested intermittently, but also because of the conflict between China and the United States about the origin of the virus, the difficulty that WHO was placed into because of its structure and because of the tug of war that went on between these two superpowers in our G2 duopoly. And because of the incessant voice of social media, the amplification of the most extreme ideas and ideologies, if I could say it simply, modernity intervened. And the problems that we face all over the world with rising nationalism, provincialism, ethnocentrism, racism, all the isms, conflated what should have been a scientific public health response that would have not eliminated this problem by any means, but certainly made it less of the legendary, historic, horrific toll of human lives that it has been.
Did the national discussion, such as it was, kind of act like a virus, borrowing some of the DNA of political, cultural splits that were already existed before the coronavirus got here, picked up some other strands from the politics of an election year and mutated?
Well, that's an interesting way to talk about it. We do talk about viruses in computer programs and the way that things go viral, and it is indeed a fair and apt comparison that the national strategic dialogue, as you mentioned, such as it was, it had the intervention of these notions of freedom and responsibility, individualism, collective responsibility, that seem to fall across in the United States are fault lines, as if doing anything for other people in a kind and generous, compassionate way was socialism, or of doing anything for freedom and individual rights was Nazism. And these two voices, exacerbated by social media, cleaved right in the middle of the behavior of the virus and the outbreaks. Surely, we should have done better. I spend a lot of time thinking about this, and I always look for literary allusions. I'm not a historian, but I love history. And I've sort of focused on Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, the best of times and the worst of times. both because at this very moment, as you and I speak, just before the Christmas season, Hanukkah season, New Year season, it is the best of times and the worst of times. Certainly the worst of times so far. We are not coming up to Mount Fuji that will have an even decline to the incline. We're more at Namche Bazaar at Everest Base Camp. There'll be mountains and mountains higher that the case count will go. But at this moment, this is the worst. We're cresting over 200,000 cases a day, 100,000 people in hospitals. Maybe 60% of US hospitals have no ICU bed capacity. The death rate is hovering between 2,000 and 3,000 a day. In other words, every single day, as many people died in Pearl Harbor or 9/11. These are horrific numbers, and yet we've become inured to them. But certainly, with 1.5 million dead in the world already, this global phenomenon is the worst of times. But it's the best of times from a science point of view. You can say what you like about the national government's response to the pandemic. It's been horrific. But the response to accelerate vaccines has been terrific, and credit where credit is due. It's not only that we had 150 vaccine candidates, that we've had 20 so far with vaccine in people's arms, that we have 3 extremely promising and 6 following them up that are likely promising. But we will go from a novel virus that leaped from a bat to a human to the largest global vaccine campaign in history in under 12 months. That's amazing. For comparison, it was 200 years from the first smallpox vaccine to a global campaign to eradicate smallpox. 70 years from the first polio vaccine to a global campaign to eradicate polio. And even in the speed with which we've gotten a vaccine, the previous race winner, if you would, was the mumps vaccine that took 4 years. But in addition to that, we're on the cusp of having a $5 at-home test for coronavirus and for COVID that will open up travel and return the travel industry. And we are on the cusp of having therapeutics, the dexamethasone, the Lilly and Regeneron contributions from the monoclonal antibodies. Deaths in hospital of sick people going into the hospital have plummeted, even though overall death rates are increasing. So the best of times and the worst of times, we'll take that from Dickens. Certainly those two are accurate. But I don't want to fail to say that the other part of his novel is equally apt, A Tale of Two Cities. On these global calls that I attend, our brothers and sisters in Taiwan and Singapore, even Japan and Vietnam, New Zealand, they look at us with horror and they say, in the nicest possible way, how could you have fucked up so badly? What happened? Because if you look at Vietnam with 200 days of no COVID, 0 cases, Taiwan 100 days, Singapore off and on 30 days, 60 days with no cases, Japan doing much better than could have been expected given its proximity to China. They have this virus under control without the massive lockdowns, without the great politicization. And they look at us as historically the exemplar and the leader. And they say, where have you been? What's wrong? And they're also talking about what happened to CDC. That has always been the leading light, the leading science, the leading moral compass for whether it was Zika or Ebola or HIV/AIDS. So A Tale of Two Cities.
Let me jump in there because it only makes, what you've just said, only makes Thanksgiving and its aftermath that much more bewildering, galling, jaw-dropping. I don't even know how to think about it. New infections and deaths were already increasing day by day before Thanksgiving. Governments large and small urged their people not to travel, not to gather with family. million shrugged their shoulders, went ahead and did what they wanted to do, and now people are getting sick at a higher rate, just like they said. And you think, all right, what did you think was going to happen? It's astounding.
Yeah, I got on every TV show that I could, and I begged people to have two Thanksgivings next year. And I didn't know what else to say. We know this virus craves intimacy. It is social distancing, even more than masks and vaccines, that drive this transmission. And when people come home and they're with family, they lower their guard, they lower their masks, they hug and they kiss and they come back together. And no amount of warning or prescience or polyandry, I mean, nothing stopped that. We had the 9 million people travel in the week before, 1.5 million on the day before Thanksgiving, the biggest travel day of the year, despite all the warnings. And Ray, as we talk, you and I today, we have not yet seen what will be the highest bump from Thanksgiving, which will be when the inevitable 3 weeks until you see the cases and 5 weeks until you see the really sick people in hospital, and maybe a couple more weeks until you see the death rate. When we see that happen, it'll be around Christmas time that our hospitals are going to be so packed that if you have a heart attack or you need to go in for chemotherapy or you have a difficult childbirth, it's going to be really complicated and difficult.
Well, let's move on with the part, the remarkable work of scientists and researchers that has resulted in not one, not two, not three, but multiple options for vaccination, ramping up production, starting to figure out how to get it into people's arms. This wonderful success that you describe also brings with it a new set of challenges. How do we figure out how to triage a country of 330 million people, a world of 8 billion people, and protect who needs to be protected first, in the second tier, in the third tier? It's a daunting challenge.
Well, it's a challenge I'm glad we have. It is certainly true that vaccines don't save lives, vaccinations do. And moving from the vaccine to the vaccination program, and as you say, the equitable allocation of vaccines. So we need to be sure that before every 16, 17, and 18-year-old in rich countries is vaccinated, that the frontline health workers in poor countries who are risking their life without enough PPE get vaccinated as well. We owe that responsibility to the world. But we will have enough vaccine. It's the cadence that it will come at and the allocation that is fraught. I'm pleased that a National Academy of Sciences put together a committee on vaccine equitable distribution chaired by my dear friend Bill Foege and Helene Gale, and they did a really wonderful job of trying to complement the twin imperatives of efficiency and speed with that of equity and justice. And if you read that report, the kind and compassionate and scientifically accurate way that they did that is really excellent. Also, the American Academy of Immunization Practice has come and more or less reaffirmed those recommendations. So I think that we'll do okay with that. I think you and I talked a long time ago about the first smallpox vaccination 200 years ago. The first anti-vax movement began about a year after the first vaccination. So that is something we've always had with us. And this vaccine has prompted its own anti-vax movement, again, along those same political cleavages. I think that we're seeing an increasing percent in the polls of people who are willing to take a COVID vaccine as more confidence in the scientific integrity of the process, more confidence in the result of people who've had the vaccine. And if this vaccine has a characteristic called PEP, which means post-exposure prophylaxis, and if it can be used in outbreak control, so that we're not just vaccinating healthy people, which is really important. We're not just vaccinating vulnerable people, which is really important. We're not just vaccinating first responders, which are really important. But we're also able to do testing, tracing, and immunization, as well as testing, tracing, and isolation. That will depend a little bit on the characteristic of the vaccine. That will reduce the anti-vax sentiment. So right now, if you add all those things together, the equitable use of the vaccine being prioritized for first responders, for the elderly in nursing homes, for people with pre-existing conditions, for essential workers. If you add that to a new and important use of vaccines, which is for outbreak control, as we did in Ebola, where we found that the Ebola vaccine had something called PEP, post-exposure prophylaxis. In other words, even after somebody had been infected with the virus and was cooking it, they could be vaccinated and the vaccine would attenuate the disease so there were no or very few deaths, and in many cases just block the disease, and in most cases block the spread. We had that same thing with the smallpox vaccine. So in both cases, we were able to use what's called ring vaccination. You find every case, you test them, and you trace them. And then, yes, you do isolate all contacts, but in addition, you vaccinate them. And the speed with which that can bring an end to an outbreak is breathtaking. It has the quality of saving a lot of vaccine, because certainly if you vaccinate only the people who are contacts of active cases, you would only require 10 or 15 or 20% as much vaccine as you want to have for herd immunity to vaccinate 5, 6, or 7 billion people. So we're watching very carefully these vaccine trials to see if the vaccines, as they come down the chute and are released and get FDA clearances, if they have those characteristics. And so far, maybe not perfect, but I'm optimistic that we'll find one of those. I do think if we do use vaccines as part of outbreak control, we will see a decrease in anti-vax sentiment, vaccine hesitancy. If people can see a direct correlation between the use of a vaccine and a lowering of mortality and morbidity and hospital admissions right away, they'll have a different view than the kind of ephemeral quality that vaccines seem to have otherwise.
Is there a set of best practices that guide our actions at this point? There are still things we don't know about the differences in efficacy between single vaccine regimes and a second dose. We don't know how long they're good for, whether it's a year or 3 years or 3 months. They may differ for the various vaccines that are rolling out. Is it licit? Is it desirable to just, once we know it's not dangerous, just start getting it into people's arms, and we'll figure that part out, those other parts out later?
It's really complicated. On the efficacy, we use some terms in medicine that may sound cold or weird, but we say that the vaccine trials to date have given a very strong efficacy signal. Clearly, I'm talking about the Pfizer and Moderna mRNA vaccines, first time we've ever made an RNA vaccine, let alone a messenger RNA vaccine. It's really just breathtaking. And we're seeing reported efficacies in the 90% plus. That's only based on 30 or 40,000 people, only half of whom got the vaccine. The other half got the placebo. It is a massive stretch to go from vaccine in the arms of 30 or 40,000 people to 300,000 to 3 million to 30 million to 300 million to 3 billion people, and try to talk ourselves into the safety signal also having arisen. You can't judge how safe this will be in terms of the odd, unusual 1 in a million side effect when you've only vaccinated tens of thousands. That's the leap of faith that we must make. And if it wasn't a pandemic, we wouldn't do that. To test the polio vaccine to see if it was safe, Fleming tested 5 million children, not 30,000. So it's a different time. A pandemic like this requires making adjustments. Once we know that the vaccine has been safe in all the trials that we've put it to, it is fair, it is reasonable, and it is of necessity that we use this vaccine. I will certainly be willing to be vaccinated right away. I'm very much encouraged to see that 4 presidents, former presidents, have said they will be vaccinated in public. I've heard of 10, maybe 12 CEOs of major corporations, movie stars. I think confidence will be built by seeing people of power and fame who are willing to be vaccinated in public. And we need to not fight the anti-vax movement. It's not fighting it. It's helping people who have concerns, many legitimate, about vaccines to understand the costs and the benefits, which in this case are stacked clearly on the side of benefits.
The Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is intended to be given in 2 doses, and the efficacy numbers are huge with the 2-dose regime. But it appears that there's also strong effect with 1 dose. Given the urgency of the pandemic and given the limited supply of the vaccine, does it make sense from an epidemiologist's point of view to administer the single doses to reach more people? Do you have to make those calculations early on in the vaccine program?
I hope everybody's listening to that question. I had a conversation with a Pfizer executive last night who strictly followed the science that 95% number is only available with 2 vaccinations. But I've looked at their published charts, and I see a blocking of disease transmission and certainly a blocking of death very early on from the first vaccine. I think this is something for public discussion. It's something for the manufacturers to really dig deep and understand better and help us with more vaccine trials of more people in more age groups and more demographics and with more pre-existing conditions. It may be that it requires 2 doses for people of a certain age with certain pre-existing conditions, and maybe the public health exigencies for doing 1 vaccination until we have enough vaccine to do 2 come into play.
Is transparency an important part of this? Things that normally don't get said or announced or discussed until further in the timeline because of the unique situation we're in now, being openly discussed with the public now. People have to make decisions for themselves, for members of their family, for national ways forward, and come to some common wisdom as people, as Germans, as Slovenians, as Americans. Even though we're not experts, is it good to bring the public in on some of these things earlier on, just because of this particular situation and this particular level of threat?
I prefer the term radical transparency, not with the adjective being because of any particular political affiliation, right or left. Uh, this time of divided um, acrimony in the United States and really skepticism about science in many parts of the world calls for radical transparency. Um, People need to understand why a vaccine trial was halted. I was very pleased to see that AstraZeneca acted with transparency and halted the trial. Um, we we are actually. I was very pleased to see that the vaccine makers, as a group, signed a document that they would not be persuaded by political pressure to what's the winemaker Gallo who said we will sell no wine before it's time. Um, and I think that you see spotlights of radical transparency, and you can see the effect on people, a breath of fresh air. And the flip side of that is when things are done under the cover of darkness, and you're not gonna, you won't win friends and influence people, and you won't quell the simmering distrust of all institutions. I mean, we should be honest. It's not just politicians, it's science, it's the arts, it's literature, it's academe. There is a rebellion against institutions, and all of us who benefit from those institutions must force ourselves to live on a diet of radical transparency.
Speaking of institutions, one of the first things the new Biden administration says it intends to do is rejoin the World Health Organization, which the United States left just recently with some fanfare. Uh, have you spoken to people at the WHO, and um, are they glad to have us back? Is it actually important for the United States to be part of it at this stage in the proceedings?
I actually spoke with WHO over about an hour ago, and I said exactly that. I said, I'm really happy that the Biden administration says that we will rejoin. And they laughed and they said, you never left. What happened was you issued a press release that you would be leaving. It's like filing for divorce. But we haven't been to court yet, and the adjudication by the magistrate hasn't occurred. So I'm very pleased to hear you're withdrawing your notice of divorce. And we will stay as married as we have ever been, and we welcome you back. We have missed you.
Is it as simple as just picking up where we left off with contacts, connections, ongoing programs, or is there actually going to have to be a remeshing of the U.S. with this international organization?
Well, there's so many people in WHO who are American. There's never been a purge. And so many of the advisory groups and the scientific groups are headed by Americans or populated by Americans. We certainly have disproportionate representation within WHO. I'm sure there will be some exchange of documents. I don't anticipate it being very difficult. There is the question of our rejoining COVAX, which is the Vaccine Accelerator. And I want to just explain what that is. It's sort of a partnership of the World Health Organization, Gavi, which is the International Vaccine Agency headed by Seth Berkley, and CEPI, which is an organization started by the Wellcome Trust and WHO, the World Bank, to accelerate the development of vaccines. There are many other nations and NGOs who've joined the Vaccine Accelerator. It's spelled COVAXX. 1X, not 2X, sorry. The purpose of this is to find a way to not only fund and accelerate vaccine development, but to purchase vaccines and distribute them around the world so that the adage, if any country has COVID, every country has or is vulnerable to COVID. And Gavi, this extraordinary organization, which over the years has purchased a huge percentage of all the vaccine made in the world, let's say they purchased it at $1 a dose, they then sold it at 50 cents a dose and made up the difference in voluntary contributions and philanthropy. Because if you don't have people, in this case, vaccinated against COVID all over the world, the vaccine will continue to ping pong back and forth among nations. It is in our best interest that we rejoin COVAX. It is in America's best interest that we help fund continued development, continued manufacture, and continued purchasing of vaccines by the poorest and most vulnerable places in the world so that there's no delay in getting the vaccine to the most remote village in Bihar or in Zimbabwe. Because if we don't, then that's where the foci of infection will continue. And as we've seen, a vaccine can jump from a bat to a human, get on an airplane, and be everywhere in 16 hours. It can also jump from a human to another human and be on an airplane in 16 hours. So this is really a time for global cooperation. We cannot solve the problem of COVID nationally. We have to solve it globally.
You've been very generous with your time, Larry. I want to close with one final question. If we've seen anything over this past 10, 11 months, it's that lessons learned in the United States don't stay learned because politics become kind of an X factor. Yes, there are core competencies that remain deposited in our great research institutions and in our experts and our formidable army of expertise that we can deploy around the world. But lessons don't stay learned. As we look out over the next year, is there any way that we can even start to talk about that? Because people like you and Dr. Fauci and many other people working in infectious diseases have said, this is not a one-off. There are going to be other pandemics. There are going to be other viruses. There are going to be other zoonotic infections that come from we don't even know where yet. We have to be ready, and we weren't. So are there going to be durable lessons that come out of this that can't be unraveled by politics?
I hope so. We are in an age of pandemics. Every year, 2 or 3 or 4 viruses spill over. Animal viruses, zoonotic diseases jump from a bat or a monkey or a chimpanzee or a bird or a pig and jump into humans and mutate and become transmissible, and an outbreak ensues. Mercifully, most of the time, that transmission is self-limited, like SARS or MERS, or if widely distributed, like H1N1, it turns out to be much more innocuous than we feared. With COVID, we hit the wrong jackpot. The virus, which became fit for humans, which leaped to humans, had a particularly, I'll be anthropomorphic if I can, a particularly evil combination of transmissibility and lethality. But with that number of viruses leaping, it's like a roll of the roulette wheel. Over the next 10 years, we will see 40 or 50 COVID-like viruses, SARS-like viruses, Zika-like viruses, Ebola-like viruses, HIV, AIDS-like viruses, H1N1, H7N9. We could have a song like viruses leaping from animals to humans. And we can't control whether they will have the combination of lethality and transmissibility that brings about a pandemic. It makes abundant sense that we build a global early warning system. It makes abundant sense that we strengthen public health infrastructure all over the world so that outbreaks can be caught while they're still in animals, really early on, or they're just in the first round with a human host, or they're caught within a country or within a region. And all of these organelles exist in fledgling, unfunded ways today. So if you have philanthropists listening, that's to place the bet. Modernity, humans living in animals' territories, cutting down rainforests, eating more bush meat, consuming more domestic meat, that aspect of modernity, coupled with transportation, the ability to move a virus from one place to another in half a day, in much less than even half of an incubation period, so that the virus can move way before it's discovered and plant itself in every county in America before we know its extent. That part of modernity makes this a particularly perilous time to ignore the threat of pandemics in the next round. So thank you, Ray, for raising that question. That is precisely what should be on everybody's agenda. There should be, and there used to be, a person at the National Security Council whose only job was to look for bioterrorism, human-caused outbreaks, and naturally occurring pandemics. That person and that post was demobilized by the Trump administration. I'm confident the Biden administration will recreate it, but it's much more than just recreating it. It's giving it the importance that we've learned is necessary over our painful 2020 experience.
Larry Brilliant, thanks for joining us. Always great to talk to you.
Ray, it's always wonderful to talk to you. I hope we see you in Oxford sooner rather than later.
Look forward to it.